Hubs. Goals. Be able to overhaul and adjust a hub. Tools needed: 13mm or 15mm cone wrenches, 17mm wrench, degreaser, grease, rags. Parts to identify: axle, lock nut, axle spacer, cone, bearings, drive side, non-drive side, and dust caps. Step 1. Assess the hub. First, remove the wheel from the bike by removing the axle nuts or opening the quick release skewer. To check the adjustment, grab the end of the axle with your fingers, turn it, and try to move it up and down. If you are able to move it up and down, feel a knocking, or if the axle does not move freely, the hub will need to be adjusted. If the axle feels dry and rough when you turn it, the hub will need to be overhauled. Adjusting and overhauling your hubs regularly can prevent damage and extend the life of your hubs. Step 2. Overhauling the hub. Disassembling. To overhaul a rear hub, first remove the freewheel or cassette using the appropriate tools. Position the 15mm cone wrench on the flats of the cone, and a 17mm wrench on the outer lock nut. Holding the cone in place and turning the lock nut to the left to loosen them. To loosen the lock nut from the cone on a front wheel, you will need to use a 13mm cone wrench instead. Remove the lock nut and the axle spacer, and unscrew the cone. Now flip over the wheel and remove the entire axle. Remove the bearings and place them aside the cone. If the hub has dust caps, it is optional to remove these with a tire lever or a large screwdriver to better assess the bearings and the hub races. But be careful not to damage the dust caps. Step 3. Overhauling the hub. Clean the parts and look for any damage. Apply degreaser to the cones and bearings as well as the hub races, and use a rag to clean and dry them all thoroughly. Look for any damage to the cone races, hub races, and bearings. Damage usually appears as small pittings or cavities, which can be easily felt by running a ball point pen along the races where the bearings run. If the pitting is severe, you may consider replacing the cones or even the entire hub. If your bearings appear worn, you should replace them. Step 4. Overhauling the hub. Reassembly. Apply grease heavily to the hub races on both sides of the hub. Carefully pack the bearings in the drive side hub race. If using loose bearings, each side of a rear hub will take 9 1/4 inch bearings. Then each side of the front hub will take 3 16-inch bearings. Grease the entire axle and reinstall it into the drive side of the hub to hold the bearings in place. Now carefully position the wheel so that it rests on the drive side axle, and screw the cone all the way down until it contacts the bearings. Install the axle spacer and screw the lock nut without tightening it down. Step 5. Adjust the hub. Use your fingers to tighten the cone against the bearings, and then tighten the lock nut against the cone. Hold the wheel upright and turn the axle with your fingers. If it moves up and down, you may feel a knocking. The adjustment is too loose and you will need to tighten the cone. If the axle does not turn smoothly, the adjustment is too tight and you will need to loosen the cone. When you are happy with your initial adjustment, use the 15mm cone wrench and the 17mm wrench to tighten the lock nut against the cone. For front hubs, you will use a 13mm cone wrench instead. Assess your adjustment by turning the axle with your fingers and trying to move the axle up and down. If the adjustment is too loose, loosen the lock nut from the cone. Tighten the cone a very small amount against the bearings and retighten the lock nut to the cone. If the adjustment is too tight, loosen the lock nut from the cone. Loosen the cone a very small amount from the bearings and retighten the lock nut to the cone. Repeat this process until the axle turns smoothly and does not move up or down.